As I already mentioned, I'm going to talk about microplastics in the aquatic environment. And also, just a small caveat, so many of these things are, I guess, not as relevant to Switzerland as the previous talk, but that's also because a lot of the things we know about microplastics have been done in marine environments. But nonetheless, I think that many of the things that we learned so far are transferable to freshwater systems. And so much of what I'm going to say, I think, applies, at least in part, to what's happening in rivers and lakes here. Okay, so when we think of plastic, we have to realize that, so first of all, I wanted to give you an overview of where does this plastic come from and where is it ending. And so it's important to see that since the onset of plastic production in around the 1950s, 60s, about 8,300 million tons were produced. And of those, you can see that most of it was discarded since then, and only a little fraction was actually recycled. And discarded here mostly means that it was landfilled, so it's lying around somewhere, sometimes covered, sometimes not yet covered. So first of all, much of the plastic is still lying around somewhere in the environment. And then there has been this very influential study published by Jambek and colleagues in 2015, where they considered the amounts of plastic waste that were generated in countries that have access to marine or to environments, or they have coasts. And then they looked at how much of the waste that these countries produced is mismanaged. So that means that there are problems with, for instance, waste leakages in landfills. So storms can, for instance, blow away waste from these landfills. And so since much of the waste that is produced contains plastic, a lot of that is plastic which leaches out of these waste deposits. And so they estimated that taking into account these different things, that about 8 million tons of plastic made it into the ocean, at least in 2010, which is for when this estimation was made. That's about 3% of the waste that was generated. But it's also important to recognize that when we talk about plastics, plastic really isn't plastic just. It's important to see that there are lots of different types of plastics. So we have PET, which all of you are familiar with as most bottles are made of PET. Then we have polystyrene, which is used for many different things. So insulation foams, but also other objects. We have rubbers that can be used for insulation, mattresses, so polyurethanes. PVC, which can be used for window frames or tubings. Then we have different forms of polyethylene, polypropylene. These are the most common ones used for packaging. And then there's lots of other stuff, like for instance, polytetrafluoroethylene, which is also known as Teflon, which is as a non-stick coating on pans. So there's a huge variety. And this also matters for what happens to them in the environment due to different properties and additives that are included during manufacturing of these plastics. All right, so we saw that a lot of waste is generated, and it enters marine systems in countries that have a coast. But this is not only through direct dumping in oceans, it also happens through rivers that can transport the plastic from areas that are further inside the countries, obviously, and take them to the coast as well. So Le Breton and colleagues, they, based on waste generation data, calculated more or less how much plastic is probably being transported by rivers in different areas into the marine systems. And it's clear that currently the biggest impact or kind of input of plastic waste is happening in Asia and here in Middle America, or kind of the tropical Africa, northern Brazil, while this seems to be less of a problem in North America and Europe. And then this plastic that comes into the sea, so part of it is buoyant. And another study from 2014 that sampled sea surfaces found that these buoyant plastics tend to accumulate in these oceanic gyres. So these are areas where the water currents converge and then they subduct. So on the buoyant plastics, they are just left here circling around. You may have heard of this in the media termed as garbage patch. So sometimes it's referred to almost as islands of plastic or a new continent, but that's a bit of an exaggeration. So these are just areas with relatively high plastic concentrations, but they are still, by eye one, it's difficult to see these microplastics. So buoyant plastics tend to be transported to these gyres. But the talk is about microplastics. And first, I also wanted to give you just an impression. So we can classify these different plastic items by size, and microplastics just refers to particles between 1 and 1,000 micrometers, or basically 1,000 nanometers and 1 millimeter. So that's what microplastics are, and then we have bigger and smaller bits. And where do these come from? There's different sources. So microplastics can come directly from different products that include them as an additive. Most typical, some cosmetics, which have them as kind of shedding agents, but they are also used industrially. The biggest source of microplastics, however, is the degradation of larger bits of plastic through mechanical processes or UV light, high temperature. So a combination of all of these breaks the polymer into smaller bits and leads to shedding off of these small particles termed as microplastics. Okay, so now that you have this background, I'm gonna tell you more or less where I'm going to take you now in this talk. So we've seen that lots of waste is generated, and this comes into the aquatic environments, mostly through rivers or direct dumping on the beaches, and it enters the sea. Then we also have this weathering going on, which is the process that is generating more microplastics. So this can happen on beaches, but also in water, even though on beaches it probably happens, or no, it does happen has a stronger effect. And so once you have these plastics in an aquatic environment, the first thing that then happens is these bits get colonized. So any surface in water becomes colonized. It acquires a microbial community that does different things. And here it's very important to realize that this coating is what mediates any interaction that these plastics have in the environment with whatever else they are interacting with. So for instance, an animal, or it affects how these plastics are transported in the environment. It may have something to do with biodegradation, if this is happening at all. It mediates or influences whether the plastic is toxic or makes it maybe even more toxic, and many more things that I can't get into in this talk. So I'll cover these three, I'll give you an overview over what research so far has found on these three first topics. Okay, so as I said, when a surface enters some aquatic environment, it becomes immediately coated with what we call an absorbome. So this is usually a mix of different types of molecules. So you can have some remains of cells like lipids, polysaccharides, some humic acids. So you get a film on the surface, which then attracts cells. So there are some pioneering cells that start colonizing this surface. And over time, you get more cells and they start forming a biofilm by splitting. And then you start getting a more and more complex community of cells that do different processes. And the important thing here is to see that, that basically in these communities, the cells are much more active than if they are solitary in the water. So processes happen more quickly here, and there's an exchange between these cells. I've shown you a cartoon, but here are some images of what this looks like in reality. So from an electron microscope. So if you look at in the beginning, the clean plastic, and then you see that over time, it clearly acquires a complex community, and some of the cells there are pretty amazing. All right, so our plastics got colonized, and now we want to look at what happens. So one of the things is that these communities can affect how the plastics are transported, as I said. And here you need to consider that these, especially the buoyant plastics, they are buoyant because they have a lower density than water. But if stuff starts growing on them, that adds density to the plastic, right? So it starts affecting how it moves in the water column. So if we look at what happens to plastics generally, if they, for instance, fall on the ocean surface, you have many polymers that are denser than seawater, and those you expect to immediately sediment. But the buoyant plastics, they can also sediment, for instance, when they are eaten by some animal and then ingested. Or you can have these particles that are floating here for some time, and then they get colonized not only by microbes. So if the plastic is bigger, then you can also have algae and other stuff growing on them. And this increases the density of these, which also leads them to sink, which has raised the question, are bottom sediments the final sink? So is this where all the plastics are going to end up finally? And the answer is not so clear. So if you look at this graph, so this is basically over time, we are looking at the behavior of different types of plastics that were used in this experiment and the density. So the higher the number, the denser is the plastic with the community that is on it. And you can see that over time, it becomes more dense. So it starts sinking into the water. But after some point, it starts becoming less dense again, right? And these ones emerged again here. So the rope. And this is because as these items start sinking in, there is less light, or fish start eating what is on these plastics. So they become less dense again. So they come back up. So it could also be that this stuff just stays in the water, just going up and down, and many of it may never even sediment. And if we look at the different polymer types, so here you've got polyethylene, polypropylene, and parts of polystyrene, which are less dense than water. So if nothing happens, they are expected to remain on sea surfaces, while there are some other polymers that are denser than seawater. And if you look at what was found in proportions in these different sites, you can see that sometimes there seems to be a segregation. So if you look at deep seas, you tend to find more of the dense polymers in relation to the less dense ones. But even so, if you look at less deep sediments, but still underwater, you still find almost everything that you would find on a beach. So there are clearly more complicated processes going on here. And then something that these communities that colonize the plastics might be doing is biodegradation, which is what many people care about, especially in terms of how bad is this pollution and how long will it be there. And in this context, there is a famous paper from 2016 that presented the discovery of a bacterium that can degrade PET. And this bacterium even evolved an enzyme they called PETase, which seems to be adapted to decomposing PET. But here it's also important to consider that even having different types of plastics, even if you have the same type of plastic, there can also be differences. And one thing that we look at is the crystallinity. So it's also basically a measure a bit for how soft or how hard, how crystalline the plastic is. And you can see that here with this scheme. So if you imagine a plastic is essentially a very long chain of the polymer, right? Mostly often just carbon. And this can be loosely or kind of in this amorphous, disordered part, or it can be very organized. So this would be the crystalline part. And so harder plastics have more crystalline areas. And the thing is that for degradation, these amorphous parts are much easier to degrade than these crystalline ones. And so bottles tend to be more crystalline than the PET that was used here. So even if this sounds like very good news, there are quite a few caveats here. But the bacterium was degrading PET. And here, just to illustrate this point a bit further, so here you have some chemical structures. So here's, for instance, PET and polyethylene. You can see polyethylene is essentially just a carbon chain, while PET has some more diverse structures. And what this means for degradation is that some polymers, like these that have these structures, have sites that the enzymes that already exist in many bacteria can cleave. So we have a good explanation for how it is possible that these bacteria can evolve and become better at degrading these polymers. But the problem with these other plastics is that the chains are inaccessible essentially for these enzymes, and they require some previous sort of predigestion, if you want, that would help maybe some biotic processes to degrade these. And this addition of these, or this predigestion, is the weathering, so surface oxidation, and those processes that pre-degrade plastics, but which are physical and not biological. And the problem is that these processes happen much less in water. So if something gets into the water and sinks, then it's going to stay almost pristine for quite some time. I did a study during my PhD where I looked at whether a community that settles on these plastics is different when you weather, so you pre-degrade this plastic, compared to a plastic that you just leave pristine. And the results are in this graph. So here, the way to read this is I had different conditions. So I sampled earlier and later, so at the second day or at the 9th day, and these were plastics that were put in the sea. And I had different ones. So it was polyethylene, which was weathered, so pre-degraded, the non-weathered one, and then glass just as a control for something that is not plastic. And the way to read this graph is to look at whether the symbols are very close to each other or whether they somehow separate. And if they are close together, it means that the microbial communities on these things were very similar on these plastics. And if they segregate, then probably there was some difference in these communities. And what you can see here is that essentially there seems to have been a difference in the communities on the weathered plastic and different to this non-weathered, but only on the second day. If you look at day 9, they all seem to be the same. When you look a bit more into these communities, you can find one specific genus of a bacterium, Oleifilus. This already says it's one that likes oil. And it was indeed present on day 2 in much higher abundance than in day 9. This is relative abundance, but it means that if these type of organisms are not able to persist and even increase their abundance, or at least maintain it with progressive or with the age of this community, then it doesn't mean that these plastics are being degraded necessarily by these communities, and they may be just consuming the products that were there from the weathering, but they are not themselves able to break up the plastic. All right, this was some insight into the transport and was already some part of what the communities might be doing or not. And I also promised that I would say something about toxicity. And so here, one of my favorite studies was this one, where they looked at birds that died of a cause that wasn't plastic, or at least it's clear that, so for instance, they were trapped in nets, fishing nets, And what the researchers did was to dissect these birds and see whether they had plastic and take these plastics out. And they considered different types of potential toxins, so DDTs, PCBs. And these toxins are thought to, because they dissolve in oily or fatty parts, and the plastics sort of emulate that. They are just pure carbon. So it's thought that these chemicals can absorb, can be on these plastics. And then when the birds eat these plastics, then these chemicals would go into the birds. So what the researchers did was look at birds. So they compared the birds that had no plastic. So here we're looking at, just focus on the top graph. And then we're looking at the plastic content in birds. So if the birds had no plastic, they're here. Birds that had a medium amount of plastic and birds that had a high amount. And we're looking at the PCB. So this is one toxin. And we're looking at the amount of these toxins, so nanograms per weight, like per weight of the sample of the bird, so grams of the bird. And what you can see here is that it doesn't seem to matter how much plastic the bird had. The level of, or the load of PCB seems to have been more or less the same everywhere. And now these graphs are for the other toxins, so DDT also seems similar. And if you want to look at a trend, then more plastic even seems to correlate with less loads of DDT, lower loads of DDT. And so no pattern, and it doesn't look like plastic has anything to do with loads of chemicals in these birds. Now I was talking about microbes, and this is where it becomes interesting. So a colleague of mine during the PhD, she was more focused on exactly these type of chemicals and the potential interactions that microbes or these biofilms on plastics can have with these chemicals. So she got plastics from sea surfaces, and she tried to isolate microbes that were on those plastics using as the only carbon source these some types of plasticizers or chemicals that are known to be in plastic or could adsorb to plastic. And so if you use this as a carbon source, you're selecting for bacteria that can only grow if this toxin is present. So DVP, for instance, is known to have a reproductive toxicity, or is toxic generally in aquatic organisms, or DEHP. And what you can see is that she found, for instance, these two bacteria that over time were able to grow on these compounds. And we know, so this, I know this looks complicated, but this is just to show you that with further analysis, so by looking at the proteins that these cells produce and by looking at the metabolites that come from the cells being or growing on these toxins, we can find what the degraded or so the metabolites are, and we can see what proteins they use. And so it is clear that these bacteria are degrading these compounds, which indicates that maybe these biofilms may actually be detoxifying these plastics. Or the plastics in water, they absorb these toxins, but they might be a site for degradation of them. So it's really not too clear in what direction actually these processes are going. But even so, you might be worried. You can ask about, oh, what if these bacteria are not present? What if there are more toxins in water? So is it still a problem for me? And here, I think, again, it's important to put everything a bit into context. So what we're worried about is that plastics are taken up by animals, which get processed into food, and we eat them, so this stuff ends up in our cells. But what we also need to consider is that many things that we use in every day also generate microplastics. So if you're wearing some polyester clothes, you might be generating fibers when you brush your teeth. If you have a carpet at home that is synthetic, so there's loads of chances to be inhaling or ingesting these compared to what might come from a fish. You might also get these into your own, so contaminate your own food. You might get contamination of these from production. So there's lots of different pathways. And also consider that when you eat a fish, usually you don't eat the guts, which is where most of this stuff would be. But even so, we can look at an animal where the guts are eaten as well. So for instance, these mussels, and we can look at how much BPA, which is one of the most probably, or this is known to be problematic and is a part of PVC, for instance. And we can look at how much BPA are we taking up if we eat mussels compared to generic loading of BPA that is in other things, food, and this BPA may come in from the production process. And it's astonishing to see that you're ingesting way more BPA from these other sources compared to some potential animal that comes from the sea or river, if you want. So I hope that this was a nice overview for you over some of the less known processes that might be going on with plastics in aquatic environments, and that there are lots of aspects that need to be considered before we come to a conclusion about whether plastics are actually, or how bad plastics really are for the environment. It's clear that if we can, we shouldn't be polluting the environment. But I think what I hope to that became clear is that most often the problem here is a problem with waste management, and it depends. We have to look at statistics by country, and there's clearly countries that can improve their waste management, while in other countries this is already fairly well handled. The other thing that I wanted to get across is that microbes are crucial for most interactions in the environment, but they often go forgotten or they are ignored. And the third thing is that even though there can be issues with the toxicity of plastics, or more specifically the additives that are in plastics, but currently science doesn't indicate that they are the main problem with plastics. And therefore banning plastics based on this, I think would be a bit premature, considering all the other benefits that we can get from plastic and considering the other problems that we have. So for instance, the transport of things packed in glass against plastic, and the CO2 emissions that are higher when you transport something packaged in glass, just to give an example of the other types of considerations. All right, so just wanted to acknowledge that obviously most of this work was done in collaboration with the colleagues in the lab where I did my PhD in the UK, and well, just acknowledge the funding. Well, so I think this is the end of my talk. If you have any questions or comments, I'm happy to answer.